Welcome to the No Shame Podcast. This is John Groders. Today's guest is Star Parker, syndicated columnist, founder and president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, and frequent guest on network television. Star is a bold and courageous voice, not only in the black culture, but in all culture. Stay tuned on No Shame.
Have no shame. No, we are not afraid. No shame. On the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid. No shame.
Welcome to the No Shame Podcast, and I am really delighted to have Star Parker as my guest today. I read you every day. I have been on your mailing list for a long time.
Well, thank you.
So I feel like I know you probably a little better than you know me, though you just referenced Holland, Michigan like you're my next door neighbor.
I probably know a lot of people you know in Holland, Michigan. We're probably related.
We are related.
Because when I'm up there, I am Dutch Reform.
Yeah, well,
I really am.
Absolutely.
You know, I have an interesting story about the Dutch Reform and why I know so much about your heritage and your area. Is Cary, Mississippi was falling apart. It was so poor in the Appalachian Mountains, so very, very poor that even the county left, welfare left. When the government leaves, you know they're in trouble. And so there was one little Dutch Reformed church down there that said, we need help. So they called out to all of the other Dutch Reformed churches in the country and asked them to help them. So they did. And they reopened the hospital. They started a lot of training programs, everything that the body of Christ should be doing when the government gets out of the way, real charity. So they came in to see their work. And they had me as the keynote speaker. That's why I know all about it. And so I was able to share my personal journey, you know, through all types of criminal activity and drug activity and sexual activity that ended me up on the welfare the same way their community was dealing with. And then about that transforming message of the Lord. And it was so encouraging to them that businessmen at that meeting that day decided they were going to work with the city council to reopen some business in that area. And even to today, this has been years ago. It's just such an incredible move of God for that moment in time that the Dutch Reformed churches probably just went on home. And the reason, because he came down from Michigan, I guess there was a lot in Wisconsin, and then some in Texas. So they all just kind of came there to Cary, Mississippi.
Well, we're known, Dutch Reformed people are known for being very stingy, but also at times enormously generous and convicted.
I think that has something to do with it. The need. It wasn't, I don't know, when you say stingy, people are sometimes just very deliberate about what it is they're trying to do. And so when that particular situation arose, they saw that we can fill this need. They had even hired a doctor from one of the African countries to come in and do all the dental work and everything else, and they were paying him aggressively so that he would take the job. So yeah, there are times that the body of Christ steps up because they see the need. The challenge of the welfare state is it has replaced the body of Christ. So people think, well, I gave it the office, so I don't need to do something else, even though it's very damaging what we're doing through welfare policy.
I want people to meet you a little bit. So if you wouldn't, I know you've probably had to tell kind of your backstory a zillion times, but for our listeners who might not know Star Parker, can you just tell me who you are a little bit?
Yeah, I have to, because I have to remind myself, you know, one of the things that the scripture tells us is that, and then they overcame the enemy with the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And so that's from the Revelation. And I thought, well, gosh, Lord, you did the blood of the Lamb part, so we do the word of our testimony. So I'm always anxious to share my testimony because I also get healed every time I share,
Cool.
you know, where I was and what God has brought me to. I got caught up in all of the lies of the left. Everything we hear in our culture today, I heard 30 years ago. They don't even change their story, the enemy and all of his little creatures. And so they were sending out the same messages we hear today, that the poor are poor because the wealthy are wealthy, that my problems were somebody else's fault, that the country's so racist I shouldn't mainstream. And in hearing all these messages, it kind of shaped my worldview. I did not know of Christ. I didn't even get raised in a Christian home, so I had nothing to balance it against, to know that there was just total lie. So I bought into it, and I felt, well, if there's no future, then why am I living like there is? And I became very aggressive in my behaviors. You know, I think often, and I pray even now, you know, when we're looking at some of the suicide that happened just this week over Parkland and Sandy Hook, and you think about, how did this happen? How does someone get so lost that they just think that there's no hope? And it's easy to get lost, and I got lost. And fortunately for me, I was exposed later to the gospel. I had gone through all of the ill decisions, criminal activity, drugs, sexual activity, in and out of abortion clinic after clinic, on welfare in and out of 7 years, 3.5 years consistently, just ruining my life and anything about the future that God may have had for me. But then one day he introduced me to some people that knew Christ, and they were able to confront me with the truth of Christ and convict me with the truth of Christ, that God is not mad at you. You know, it's interesting how many people want God to be mad at them because they're so mad at themselves. And so I just accepted it. I just accepted that he loved me, that he died for me, that he wanted me whole. And so I was able to transition into that new understanding. And in transitioning into that new understanding, I got back in college, I got a degree, I started a business. After the 92 Los Angeles riots destroyed my business, I started focusing on social reform. And so that's why I'm in the work I am in today, running an amazing organization, if I can say so myself, in Washington, D.C., so that we can point to the truth about what the damage that the welfare state has done and what God really wants for the poor. So we fight poverty. We look to just restore dignity through the messages of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. That's where the Lord is when you talk about how do you take your lot, the set of circumstances you were born into, and make them a journey to your destiny. What is it that we are supposed to do? And one of the things we need to do is get the government outside of that equation.
Talking with Star Parker here on the floor of the NRB in Anaheim, California. Star, who have you discovered is listening to your voice? Tell me about your audience.
Well, one thing we have is, in Cure is 3 programs. You know, we're very focused and systematic in how we're getting our messaging out. So, of course, we have a policy program. So I have listening to that message now, even people in the White House and those that are elected officials, to talk about what should we be doing to reform welfare. What are ideas of transition for our society? And we've come up with some amazing things that, you know, are not getting the headlines of the news right now, but that's okay. It's making a reality of people's life. Unemployment rates are down lower than they've ever been, in particular in our minority communities. But another thing that we do and the messaging I talk to is through our media center. So we house blackcommunitynews.com, which I think you were on last year. Blackcommunitynews.com gets out to about 3 million now, to where we can just constantly give them a more conservative Christian message. So we look at the Judeo-Christian heritage in the way that we promote the news. And so that's a news network. And then we also have a clergy center. So my market and target are in that clergy world where we know that there are 4,000 to 6,000 African-American pastors serving in our most distressed zip codes who haven't bowed to the Baals. They're Christian men. They believe the Bible. And so we're organizing them so that we can equip them and educate them on matters of their community so that they can go out and do what God has asked them to do to heal them.
She's an amazing voice, and I'm really enjoying a chance to just sit down with you because I read you every day or every day that email comes. But
wonderful.
I really am paying attention to your voice.
Oh, thank you.
I just pray for your microphone. But I want to ask you about freedom of speech. How have you experienced that there's still freedom, and in what cases, even recently, have you found where your voice has been shut down, and where?
Well, that is an interesting question because in addition to our blackcommunitynews.com, which is our high note, I'm also a syndicated columnist with Creators, which is what you're referring to, what you're reading on a weekly basis. I write a nationally syndicated column. Who would have thought? I graduated high school barely literate, and now I'm a writer, author and a writer of a weekly column that goes out to a few hundred internet and newspaper sites. So we're reaching about 7 million through that particular column. But to your question, yeah, that secular society that hates messages of truth or do everything they can to get me put out of a paper, put off of a website, dismissed from in a news site, but also from the campuses. You know, I've been on the college campuses for 25 years. I've been on over 250 campuses. And although I've ran into opposition and protests and all of the other things that come with, you know, going out and getting a witness in some of these campuses, this is new for them to then refuse you once you're on contract, to say you're not coming to our school. And what's really fascinating about what happened in the last couple of weeks is it was a Christian college that said we're not having this voice on our campus. So this is a new place for, I think, our society to start seeing the washing away of Christianity, to remove that particular voice in our society. You know, whenever you shine a light, even in a dark room, even if it's a very, very small light, the whole room now is lit. And so there is this movement to make sure that Christianity is in persecution and wiped outside of the public square. And I'm experiencing some of that myself.
Just to put that in context, and I only know this because I'm reading what you're writing, but just within the last month, Star was invited to speak on a Christian college campus. I don't know whose voice I'd rather have speaking to my college students than you and others like you. And then, like has been happening, you were disinvited.
Right.
How did that play out?
Well, it's still playing out. In fact, it's so aggressive now that the president went on the offense against the student who invited me. They actually requested a list of all of the students that are involved in the club. They had already approved the club, and they had already rejected another speaker. So by the time they got to me and rejected me because she didn't dot an I across a T, made them suspicious of, wait, what's going on here? And now it's got into the place where my last conversation with the student was, you probably need to talk to an attorney, at least just to get some insight, because if now they're asking for the list of who else is participating in your club, this can get a little challenging. I can't get too involved in it because my contract was with my lecture agency. Their contract was with that same lecture agency, which is Young America Foundation. So now it's complicated because the school is trying to pretend that it had nothing to do with the speech or freedom of speech. It only had to do with she was outside of order. And they went as far as to then tell the whole student body in their chapel that she was out of order and caused all of this challenge on the internet. So I really want her protected, and we should pray for her because, these are the types of things that happen to a person's career. Next thing you know, they're out of school and then they're damaged, as we saw what happened on the mall with a gentleman who the native got in his face, and the next thing you know, he's now in lawsuit to try to get his reputation back.
We would pray and not just talk about it, but pray that God uses for good all these efforts to squelch. I mean, we've seen what happened with Ben Shapiro.
Yes.
Once he was denied going to speak on solid college campuses, we all wanted to hear what he had to say.
Right.
Before that, so I would hope, what were you going to say to those poor, innocent college students?
Well, usually when I go to the campus, we're talking about breaking the cycle of poverty. We've had 50 years of the government trying to do that, and look what has happened. We have sent whole communities into total ruin. We've collapsed marriage, we've collapsed ethics, and nothing is working in that. And yet we're still spending about $900 billion a year on these anti-poverty programs. And so that's what I would have talked to them about and say, maybe we should look at a different model. Charity belongs to the church. But this is a Christian college. They should know that charity belongs to us. Maybe we should think about market-based solutions to fight poverty, because the government solutions to fight poverty have not been effective. $24 trillion later, the poverty rate hasn't changed. It's still 25% of the population. Different people, but the same percentage. So something's gone wrong.
You sound like a scientist, right? You've done an experiment, and now you want to try another experiment.
Right. Well, no, they won't even break the model. They like the way things are. You hear the Democrats doing it now. Medicaid for all. It's like, honey, we have Medicaid for some. It's called Medicaid. You want No. We already have an anti-poverty program that takes over, where government takes over. You want to see what happens when government takes over everything? Go look into any inner city in our country and you'll see what happens. We don't have to go to Venezuela or Cuba. We can go to South Central LA. We can go to South Chicago. We can go to South Brooklyn. We need to stop the left from trying to do what God has ordered us to do, frankly.
You wrote yesterday about Russiagate.
Oh, yeah.
You had a comment on where we're sitting today at the end of a $40 million investigation.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on that?
The Democrats were saying, we really want to talk about health care anyway. Well, good, because the president jumped them on and said, then yes, let's talk about health care and how you guys have just corrupted a whole 1/6 of our economy by promoting this Obamacare to correct only 20 million people's problem. We have 20 million people in the country who their boss doesn't provide it. They make too much money for Medicaid, and they don't have the income to buy it on the open insurance market. You would think that we would try to look for more open market solutions so that they would be able to afford. I mean, look at places like NRB, which is where we are. You have options when it comes to health care. We have Liberty Health Share. We have the Christian, the one I love best is called Psalm 23, because we just have these answers for people that have need. So here we have the Democrats, liberal Democrats, trying to upset, and they did upset, all of this economy where you have 320 million people, 300 million of them weren't on the table. 20 million are. So what we want to do is have that discussion so that we can say what is the best scenario for 20 million without having to upset the whole thing and build it out. Medicare for all. Honey, Medicare doesn't even really work. But that's why seniors have to dig deeper to support or supplement their Medicare. And that's why poor seniors have to be on Medicaid and Medicare. So if they want to have that discussion, I'm so glad the president is saying, then let's talk about it so the American people can understand what's really going on. That we're talking about a very small percentage of people that we need to care about, we need to think about, but we don't have to upset the entire healthcare system to get this work done.
I'm speaking with Star Parker here on the floor of the NRB, National Religious Broadcasters, who are celebrating their 75-year anniversary of basically trying to defend freedom of religious speech in this country. And they told us last night at the plenary about how it goes back to 1944 and radio broadcasters are being shut down. The more things change, the more they say the same.
Isn't that something?
And if you don't recognize, although Star and I are related, she looks to me like an African-American woman. I look like a Dutch old white guy. And yet she's one of the leading voices right now. Will you explain to me identity politics?
Well, identity politics has segmented us into all these little people groups, and each people groups get votes, or they can be assured to vote. Unfortunately for the Democrats, that model is also falling apart, and one of the things that we're strategically now doing is getting people voting on their issues. What is it that most important to you? That's the Trump strategy. That's how he won that election. What is most important to you? He asked the Christian world. They said judges and abortion, ending it. He said, you got it. Then he went to this community of people and said, what is most important to you? He said, that border. We really need to stop this inflow. It's changing our country, and it's changing rapidly, and we don't want to learn Spanish. We don't want to keep paying for all of this ill. We don't want our kids unsafe because we can't seem to control the border. He said, you got that. He asked this community. And so what we're doing now, strategically, the GOP, which is uncommon for the GOP, is to say perhaps we should get strategic, because identity politics is this. The Democrats, very cleverly, if you will, took over the public schools. They began to promote messages of secularism, and then they started to combine those messages of secularism with social justice messages that appeal to very specific people group, because they could see the demographic shifts. The demographics have been shifting a long time, and the Republican Party has not paid attention to it. We now, as a country, have 180 million people of European descent, Americans, but we have 140 million of other descent, not European descent, but yet they're still American, and they've been trained 2 generations in these government-controlled cesspools we call schools, that America is guilty of injustices. And in doing that, they've been able to segment these little groups. So we now have the Asian people, we got the black people, we got the Korean people, we got the you name the group. I mean, now we got the gay people, we got the women people, we got all these little people groups, and yet when you really think about it, it is so far from what the Lord has called us to do, which is become a unique individual that you were birthed to be and reach for that destiny, that purpose, find it, discover it, go for it. You need freedom. The collectivism doesn't work. So we have to make sure that we appreciate the collectivism doesn't work, but people do have interest, and some of those interests we are not addressing. If you are a parent, you have an interest in children and where they go to school. So we need to talk about parental options so that money will follow children to schools parents want. If you are single and trying to move your way through life, then we need to talk about issues of housing, because this is a big problem for people that are not married to be able to go out and afford to live alone in today's marketplaces. So there are issues that one of the things we do at CURE, and we do it deliberately, is we focus on the issues of the communities we serve, the ones that are in the distressed zip codes, because we could talk all day about green matters, but that's not what they're talking about. That's not what they're thinking about. They want safety in their community. They want housing addressed. They want education addressed. They want health care addressed. And so those are the things. Economic empowerment. How do we drive business here, which the president has done an incredible job with his Opportunity Zone initiative to start driving money into these poorer communities so that we can, and not government money. We're talking private market money into these poorer communities so that they can recover themselves.
Talking with Star Parker, and she is like a skipping stone over a sea of issues, because you have been deeply involved in studying these and thinking about these and praying about these. Yeah. And I want to stop just for a little bit on some of these that you touched on. So Betsy DeVos is being crucified by the left because she wants to increase some funding for charter schools at the expense. I was reading it of Special Olympics. But what do you think schools, like you mentioned education, a cesspool of education, what's the best thing we could do to create the healthiest next generation of educated Americans? What do we need to do?
You allow money to follow children to schools the parents want. You remove all the barriers that the unions have put up. You remove all of the Blaine amendments. People don't even know that in 39 states you cannot have money follow children to the schools the parents want because it's illegal. They've passed what's called Blaine amendments in their constitutions, which simply means it was an anti-Catholic initiative, but today it means poor people can't get out of failing schools. They have no options, no choices. So we have to get rid of that. That's going to take a Supreme Court decision, which interestingly, 2 cases are going to the court right now. Even as we speak, they're at the court. And so that could be settled very, very soon here. But as well, you need to, yes, she needs to revamp the Department of Education. The government really has no business in the education business. People don't appreciate that. The Department of Education was formed in 1979 to deal with a specific crisis at that specific time. And that crisis at that time was that African Americans in this country were not being able to exercise their freedom to go to any school they wanted to. And so the government built out oversight for the states that were in violation of federal law of, the constitutional protections of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, as well as the Civil Rights Act. They were in violation. So the federal government came in and said, you got to stop this stuff. So now the question on the table is, that was 1979. Perhaps we should look where we are today, because where we are today is states like Ohio. You have parents, black parents, who moved out of certain communities so that their kids could get better schools, and they're being bused back into that community because it's just a busing program, and the busing program doesn't know what color you are. It's just, and they're like, well, no, we don't want to go back over there. We left there. We moved that. So of course, we're a long way from 79, as well as we have computer now. We have this 100-year-old model of doing education in the country, and we're in the 21st century. So I'm happy that Secretary DeVos is looking at new options based on the new child.
What tops your list? And I'll start with what's frightening, and then we're going to get to what's good too, because we are people of hope. But what frightens you kind of the most when you look at the culture as it is today? What are you nervous about the most?
I'm nervous that the rates of people that get them go to church on Sunday morning has dropped to 100 million. That's healthy on one hand, but on the other hand, when you're talking about a nation of 300 million, where it used to be 50 million didn't get up and go to church. It was a small percentage of the society who didn't go to church. And the founders were very clear that this model of self-government can't work outside of religion. You have to have a moral people, and that means that you have to have a heritage. Well, our heritage is Judeo-Christian. That's where we get most of our laws. This is the concept of how we self-govern, how we know what's yours and what's mine, how we know that your right stops right here. And when you remove those barriers, if you will, the King Solomon said, don't move these landmarks. If you do it, you get lost. People get lost. And so that's my biggest concern. That's what keeps me up in the evenings praying, is that we're so lost now. We've totally collapsed marriage as a result of the war on religion, where we scrubbed our schools from all reference to God. We had that war on marriage with that feminist movement, and then we had that war on poverty at the same time that says don't even worry about consequences that may come naturally when you're sexually promiscuous. We have now safety nets, and so marriage collapsed. In the 60s, marriage rates were about 75% of adult population. Now they're right up under 50% of adult population, which is one reason we have a housing crisis, and a lot of people live on the street. But so that's my biggest problem, if you will, in my prayer. But when you look at the good news, the good side of it is 100 million still get up and go to church.
Right.
And so it's one of the reasons I joined the board here at the NRB. It's one of the reasons that we need to strengthen messengers like you and Cure and others that are pushing into culture to force those 100 million that are getting them going to church every Sunday to push into the culture, to recapture the culture, to get it to the place where people, not by demand, but choose to serve the Lord, so that we can have a limited role of government. And the government is totally out of control. 60% of Americans now get more benefit from government than they put in. You can't go on, with collapsed family, out of control debt, and just a big swelling welfare state is just not a formula for a great country. So my mission is to try to help correct that. And I'm starting with the lost sheep, the weakest little link, which is those that are on our system right now. and trying to build there. The anti-poverty programs are a quarter of our annual budget. So that one wheel is just turning in the mud. We're not going to get out of this problem if we don't look at the anti-poverty programs. And I'm just concerned. You know, God was very clear when he got up to read his turn in the synagogue. The scripture was already open. That was that day that he said the Spirit of the Lord is on him and had anointed him to preach the gospel to the poor. Well, you can't have the government in charge of your poor people if you're supposed to be preaching the gospel to them. You know, when he saw homeless and hungry people, his disciples came and said, what are we going to do with all these people? He said, bring them to me, feed them. He didn't tell them go to the Romans and set up a food stamp program. You know, we're just so out of order when it comes to how God looks at poverty. And in particular, when his cousin came to him, he had his disciples come to him. His cousin was in jail, and he had his disciples go to the Lord and say, are you the one, or should we look for another? Remember when that happened? And what did he tell him? He said, just go tell John this. Blind people are seeing, deaf people are walking, lame people are getting healed. Another group is this is happening, and the gospel's being preached to the poor. Always dead people are getting up. Did I mention that? And the gospel's being preached to the poor. I mean, this has to be a great miracle. So that should be the mission of the body of Christ, is to get the government out of charity and get back in.
You know, John the Baptist was in jail when he asked that question in Machaerus. Star Parker is my guest today, and the beautiful thing about a podcast, if you're listening to this podcast, I mean, I hope you're taking notes, because you don't get to discuss at this kind of length on the evening news, and you get a chance to hear the breadth of some of your perspectives on this. But like John the Baptist, he kind of went public with his faith, and he ended up losing his head. You know,
oh well.
What happens to Star Parker? What kind of emails do you get? What is the risk you're taking?
I pay people to read that stuff, and I keep the women from it. I'm like, don't y'all read that stuff, because it'll poison you.
Beautiful.
You have to guard your heart. You have to watch your heart. I'm not reading that stuff. And another thing that I do to encourage my faith is I go to Italy every year to see what the people that went before me went through. I go there for my faith and my fashion, and I have found so many saints that, you know, like Bartholomew, you know, in one of the translations, they called him Nathaniel. And God, when he saw Nathaniel, he said, there's purity. He said, that man has no guile.
No guile.
And you know what they did to him? They stripped his skin off of him.
Yeah.
Every time you see the statue of him, he's carrying his skin. Because, you know, when you follow the Catholic, you know, the gospel was for poor people. They couldn't read, so they did everything in pictures, and boy, are they graphic. So that's why I remind myself that this is nothing compared to what they had to do. I mean, I went down to the catacombs one year, and they were digging graves big enough for their entire family, because they knew that's what was going to happen. They were not willing to do what, like that Christian school, well, we don't want to rock the boat, or some of these other, well, we should probably think more about social justice. They weren't doing that then. They said, no, the gospel and the gospel alone, and we're going to believe it. And I can't not believe it, because what he's done for me, you know. I have to think back sometimes and say, well, I could be under the jail. I could be dead like many of my friends. One day I was riding through LA, right in the neighborhood where I used to be into my little drug life and stuff, and saw one of the men that I used to live with. I was pregnant by another one, but I lived with that one, and he had all of his belongings in a shopping cart sitting there on the bus stop. And I know God had him sitting there that day, and me caught by that light that day in a very nice car that he had blessed me with. And I could not believe it. I got chills, because that could have been me. So anyway, so no, it doesn't bother me, but I don't read it. I'm not reading that stuff. Those people could write all they want to, and they can know that I'm not reading it. So you can write anything you want to and use all the cursing you want to, but I wish you would leave my phones alone, because the little girl that answers our phone, she doesn't deserve to hear your venom. She doesn't deserve to hear all of this stuff from these vile LGBTQers who just can't seem to get over the fact that some people say, I believe the scripture, and the scripture says don't do that.
This is Star Parker on the No Shame podcast. Star, I've been in the catacombs with Domitilla, and I felt the same way.
Oh, man.
These people could have been sitting in the front row of the Coliseum, could have been drinking champagne and having ice cream and living the Roman life.
That's right.
They gave it all up to follow the way.
I know.
And the cost was they get to go underground 18 floors and celebrate with a bunch of dead bodies the birthday or the death day of their loved ones.
I know.
And they did it.
I know.
It was worth it.
I
How
know.
could anything be worth that trade?
I know.
And it gave them no social standing. It gave them
Right,
no
right.
advantage politically or
Right,
business.
that's
They
right.
did it because the Holy Spirit was real to them, and it
That's
drives me towards them in the same way.
Yeah,
It's powerful.
yeah,
World's not worthy of
Intercessor.
them. Star, it's just if you. How can people follow you? Where can they find you?
Oh, Star Parker. I think if they go to Star Parker, they're going to find me. I have a Star Parker Facebook. They said I have a Star Parker Twitter. I have a Star Parker Instagram. I have a Star Parker YouTube. I have a Star Parker Urban Cure. oh, I have a lot of Star Parkers. So if you just look up Star Parker, you're going to find me. We appreciate it. And we're a nonprofit. So if they want to generously give into our coffers, that is how we do our work. We take no government. We don't believe the government should be in these businesses. So we don't want them giving away other people's money, and certainly not my own. That's another thing I'm mad at that Mueller about. I owe the IRS right now a few dollars. I'm like, why don't I just, what? That's what you used it for? But yeah, we're having fun. And so anyone that wants to be a part of us, we really appreciate it, the generosity of people that help us continue to put our voice out.
Well, this show is named after Romans 12 when Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. He ends up paying a price, but he also changed the world. This is Star Parker. She's an apostle in my view of our day. Support her ministry. Listen to what she has to say. And it's just really a blessing to have you on this little podcast. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Have no shame.